This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Today, we have a little bit of a special episode. I'm joined by Mustache Chris yet again. I'm Steve, and we are going to talk about one of Chris's favorite genres of film, and that is horror. And I guess what got us talking about this is that I don't know if horror is particularly my favorite genre, and I think Chris is going to at least make a case for us. And so, Chris, you love this genre of horror. Maybe just starting off, just so we can everybody get on the same page. Maybe tell us, what is to you the idea? What is the essential elements of the horror genre?
Personally, I think the one essential thing that there's two, right? Horror has to scare you to some degree, right? Make your skin crawl, and I think the other part is horror has to make you feel uncomfortable. Yeah, to me, while you're watching the film, and then when you walk away from it, you have to feel uncomfortable with what the film showed you, or the ideas that it presented, and you usually end up having to stew on them for quite some time. Horror is a unique genre too, because it tackles a lot of taboo subjects. It takes a lot of emotions and beliefs and just boils them down to their base level. I think that's where I'm talking about, in the sense of making you feel uncomfortable.
And so why do you think that horror is an important genre then?
For those exact reasons. I think horror is it's an interesting genre because anything's open, really. Any kind of taboo subject you can pretty much tackle. And I can list a ton of films where, the most taboo subjects you can possibly think of, stuff like cannibalism and any of these things, even demonic possession, can be explored within the horror genre, where with, say, something like a serious drama, I believe it's more difficult to do so. They can do those things, but horror is really the genre that kind of I personally find is, if a horror film does something that's taboo and it gets somewhat popular, it gives the more serious genres of filmmaking, the more serious art forms, if you want to use those words, an opportunity to give it a different spin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with this, is that horror as a genre is, at its best, is meant to make us think more about something. What's maybe a horror movie that sticks out to you that's a gem of the genre?
I would say The Exorcist is one. I think that really stands out, right? I believe, I could be mistaken, I believe it actually did get some Academy Award nominations. I don't know if it won anything or not, but The Exorcist, it forces you, in that movie in particular, to deal with something like demonic possession. Is it possible? Was this fake? Was this not fake? Is demonic possession all just, some form of mental illness, some version of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder? Or, you can list a ton of them, right? That's one. Something like Nightmare on Elm Street, we had done a podcast on that, and that's another one that kind of forces you to kind of question, reality and dreams, and where does reality start and where does the dream start, and can we really be able to truthfully differentiate the difference when it gets to a certain point where they start merging in our heads? Halloween is another one. I'm just listing off some of the classics, right? Halloween is, what would you do in that situation if you had some guy in a mask that was just chasing you and you had no idea who this person was? Those are just like 3 examples off the top of my head. But horror also can be used as like kind of political metaphors too. I mean, George Romero, who was famous for the zombie genre, basically kind of created it with Night of the Living Dead. The sequel, Day of the Dead. Well, people say like Night of the Living Dead. I think he straight out talked about this too. Like Night of the Living Dead was kind of like a metaphor for segregation in the United States, and Dawn of the Dead, which was the sequel, was kind of used as a take on consumerism that was going on. That was very popular in the States at the time.
You know what I think's interesting with horror, and I think that we had definitely talked about that. It in a way, it's very much like science fiction because it can use metaphor and it can step you out of your day-to-day life to explore particular issues, like you were saying with Dawn of the Dead, that it was the metaphor was something larger. But do you think that, I think that for me, and I wonder what you think about that, is a lot of times horror turns, and especially more modern horror movies, they just turn into a shtick where they have a hook of something like zombies or ghosts or something, and then that's everything. And I think to me, that's where horror fails. It's just slasher. It's just blood and guts. It's just a shock. And then we don't really have anything else to grab onto it.
Well, I will say, like, there's definitely that in the horror genre, right? It's like, I'm not going to sit there and lie. Like, I enjoy some of those movies, right? Like, I've watched all the Halloween movies. I enjoy some of the slasher aspects, and there's a lot of horror comedy. And, people, they're probably familiar with it, but like stuff like Evil Dead. Believe it or not, Peter Jackson, who's famous for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he started off in horror, and he has this movie. I believe it's called Brain Dead. And it has the distinction of being the bloodiest movie ever made. And I'm pretty sure it holds that record still for the most amount of fake blood ever used. And it's if you like that type of horror comedy type stuff, you have to watch this movie. But it is a brain dead movie. Like there's not anything really going on in it, right? Like there's no deeper meaning or kind of like social commentary. It's just fun if you like that type of gallows humor. But I find that horror kind of ebbs and flows in the sense like, I guess like kind of any other genre where there's high points and then there's low points and then there's high points and then there's low points. Like there was a couple of years there where in France they were producing stuff and it was called like they were calling the Nouveau Extreme Cinema, where I guess all these French filmmakers were inspired by a lot of American horror films and they started doing their own takes on it, and there were some really well-made films that came out of it. Now, like I said, extreme, right? So for the audience, that type of stuff makes you squeamish. I would probably suggest not watching it. If it doesn't bother you, then I'd say give it a stab, right? Stuff. There was one called High Tension. There was one called Martyrs. Martyrs in particular is really, really, really out there. And there was another one, I believe, called The Descent. And these were all filmed by French filmmakers. A bunch of them ended up coming over to the United States once Hollywood saw, what these guys were up to. And they're like, oh, these guys are incredible. And they've directed a couple of films, American horror films. I'm trying to remember the one, I believe it's two friends that direct movies together. One of them, they did High Tension. They ended up doing the Hills Have Eyes remake, which I thought was really well done. I thought was superior to the original in a lot of ways.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. There's some of the movies, it's so funny that some of the movies that I've seen recently, like there was the big, maybe it was around the year 2000, that in the early aughts where the Japanese ones were really popular. The remake of The Ring from the Japanese Ring. And I think the big problem that often happens with horror is that they have a setup that's really interesting, but then it just doesn't go anywhere. It just doesn't. Insidious was another one like that the setup was kind of interesting, and then it just falls flat. Like, I mean, how much can you see a demonic possession? All right, it's a demonic possession, and I don't know. It doesn't. I haven't seen a horror movie in a long time that made me want to think about something more, or even during the movie, like, oh, okay, it's an interesting scenes. The graphic effects are pretty interesting of the gore, but then it just doesn't really leave you with anything. It's certainly, I haven't seen a horror movie in a long time that's worth revisiting. Are there horror movies that you revisit and watch again?
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, you mentioned Insidious, and I'm like, I was with that movie right up until the hooves, and it was, and it was like, it's not to, I don't want to give it away, but right up until that happens, I'm like, I'm out. This, like, I was enjoying the ride, and then that happened. I was like, no, I can't do this. Like, in terms of horror films that I revisit Nightmare on Elm Street, we had talked about that before. There's another one, and I consider it horror, but I don't know if you ever saw the film Fallen with Denzel Washington, where he's a detective, and the demonic possession passes on through touch, and he has this, like, the song "Time is on my side." I won't ever sing again, guys. But I revisit that quite often because I quite like that one. Martyrs, I had mentioned earlier. I watched that one a fair amount. Hills Have Eyes, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, especially the 2003 remake, which I thought was better than the original, just because Lee Ermey is in it, and he just has a blast playing this corrupt, like, disgusting pretend sheriff. And he said it was the funnest. He said it was the most fun he's ever had making a movie, because he just got to do whatever he wanted. Apparently, they just stuck a camera in front of him, and they're just like, you know what, you do you, buddy. And so he just, like, created this whole character. Yeah, I mean, those are a couple off the top of my head. Like, I constantly watch horror, like, all the time. It's one of my favorite genres. Like, one of the reasons I like it so much is I just find there's a ton of creativity that goes on in the horror genre that doesn't go on in a lot of other genres. Like, in terms of, like, you know, the crime TV shows, they're all the same, you know, and people will push back against horror and say that. But I mean, yeah, the slasher horror films are similar, right? But that's like a subgenre of, like, within the horror category, right? And like zombie films, it's like, yeah, they're similar. The people have done different twists on it. I mean, 28 Days Later, there's arguments whether is that a horror film, but there's one I watch all the time too. 28 Days Later, is that a horror? I mean, is that a zombie film or not? I mean, it's up for debate. Like, I consider it a zombie film, even though technically they're infected by a virus. You know, but that's like one thing too, right? And then you have like your kind of supernatural horror, which is like your ghost stuff, right? And then you have like your extreme horror, which is, you know, the blood, guts, and the gore done in like a realistic type of fashion, right? And then there's the serial killer genre too, where, you know, people will argue with me, but, you know, Silence of the Lambs, I consider that a horror film. Like, it's stuff that like gets people try to distance away from horror because it's, I don't know, it's supposed to be high art or what have you. Silence of the Lambs is a horror film, you know. Almost all of these, you know, catch a serial killer type movies, they're all, to me, they're all within the horror genre.
It's funny. I think for me, the horror movie, and I don't know if you would consider it a horror movie or not, that really sticks with me, and we'll watch it every Halloween, is Monster House. It's I want to say it's from maybe around 2012. It was a computer animated movie, and it hits the themes. Yeah, if you wanted to watch it especially with your kids to just be scared, you can get that. But it's coming to age. It's dealing with people who are different. I mean, and all those different themes that come out of it. I think you can look for that in something like horror. I think personally, science fiction is a better genre for that. But then I think horror for me, like I want to see something that's just fun. Like, I don't know if you would consider the Blade trilogy horror or not, but it's just fun. It's fun action, but it has that vampire vibe going on with it. And it gets into the history of vampires. So it demystifies it kind of. I think that was very well done.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like Blade is horror, right? It's action horror, but it's horror, right? Like same thing with Underworld, which is similar, right? There's werewolves and there's vampires. I can have like stuff with werewolves and vampires and be like, well, no, this is like an action film. It's like, no, it's a horror film. And it's shot like a horror film. And much of Blade is kind of shot like a horror film too, especially probably the most iconic scene in all the Blade movies is that opening scene where they're in the club, and the light is flashing, then it switches to like the blood. Like that's straight up horror, right? Is that going to make you like have a hard time getting to sleep at night? Probably not, but that's horror too. Like like The Ring you mentioned The Ring, right? Like when I don't think I'm giving anything away or whatever. Like she crawls out of the TV, right? Like that legitimately, when I watched that the first time, I was like, oh my God, I had the hardest time sleeping for a couple of days because the whole movie had just built up to that moment and they pulled it off perfectly. I ended up watching all the Japanese ones after that because I came out when I was quite young. Yeah, for sure. Like the horror is like kind of like all over the place. And you mentioned like kind of like a kid's movie, right? Like my kids are obsessed with less so my daughter because she's getting older, but my son, he's obsessed with Hotel Transylvania, which is, if people aren't familiar with it, it's Adam Sandler voiced over cartoon movie about a vampire living in like a haunted mansion or that's like runs as like a resort for other monsters. Like is that horror in the sense of like scary? No, but it takes from horror, and then it repackages in a way that's like fun for kids.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. If somebody's a skeptic of horror, what do you think is the movie that they should go out that will really draw them into that genre?
The Exorcist. Yeah, for sure. Watch that. But I think most people have seen that. That's another one that would kind of be a fun one. Dog Soldiers, that's a kind of lower budget movie, but it's about werewolves and these British soldiers get isolated and they end up getting attacked by werewolves in a cabin. And it's just fun. I think it mixes a lot of stuff that horror does really well, and kind of action, comedy, scary, a little bit of blood, a little bit of gore, not too much. The Descent is another one that was actually not Neil Jordan. I'm trying to remember his name right now. I'm blanking on the director's name, but that's another one. It's cave divers. When they go into this cave and then they end up uncovering like a monster that lives in the cave, right? Which is like kind of like classic horror film trope, but it's really well done. And it's an all it's an all female cast, or they're all female cave divers. That's one. If you just kind of like full bore, just kind of get right into it, like people Martyrs is one, but like I said, I suggested earlier, like if you're squeamish or, kind of taboo subjects like really bother you, I would suggest not watching that one. Yeah, watch the George Romero films, in my opinion. He's one of the best at it. Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, even the remake, Dawn of the Dead, I quite enjoyed. I thought that was a lot of fun. People had a little conniption because the zombies ran in that one. I guess that was probably the influence from 28 Days Later, but regardless, I thought it was a well-made film. I had fun watching it. Yeah, those are just off the top of my head right now.
There's a great one that you can find it on YouTube. I don't know if it's on any of the streaming services or not. It came out, I want to say, in the late 80s. It was called The Kill Box. It was released under two different names, but it was about a voodoo priestess during the Civil War who was turning all the dead soldiers on the Confederate and the Union side into zombies. And so it's essentially a zombie movie set during the Civil War. And there's so many great actors. I want to say that Christian Bale was in it. Corbin Burnson was in it. There was like 3 or 4 like really bankable stars in this solidly B movie. And that's the kind of thing that I like to see in horror, is that it takes something that you don't expect and you're getting your expectations turned on their head. And I think that that's what horror can do well, is to take things that don't seem like they can make sense and play with it. To me, the thing where it will often fall flat is, oh, okay, here's zombies that just go and kill everyone. And here's a gore fest to just shock you. And then it's like, yeah, that was fun. It's like eating a whole package of ice cream, a gallon of ice cream. It was fun, but did it really leave you with anything? That's what I think that bad horror does. But good horror can make you either think about something a little bit deeper or just leave you that somebody did something creative and tried something different. Like you said, what can you really do that's super creative with the cop procedural genre anymore?
Yeah, it's like everything's already been done. And like with horror, and if you do it well, people will pretty much go along with the ride, regardless of what it is, right? If it's done well, regardless of how, on the surface of it, it seems absurd. If it's done well, people will go along with the ride. I mean, I'm trying to think of that movie. I think it was a comic at first. It was like Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
And I went with it. I was like, you know what? This is fun. I went with it. I thought it was, I enjoyed the movie. That's just an example, right? And then there's like the Evil Dead has one too, or, you're watching a film with Bruce Campbell and he's like literally like cutting off his own hand, and then his own hand starts attacking him, and then the later sequels, there was like Army of Darkness where he like goes back in time and he's like in medieval times and he's like twirling around his shotgun going like, this is my boomstick. And it's just like you said, it's like eating a tub of ice cream. Like you're not going to walk away with, with a ton of like deeper meanings in some of these films. I mean, there is that in horror. A lot of it actually, like it's a matter of convincing you or Frank to do a couple more horror films with me. But you guys aren't the biggest fans of the genre. But a lot of the times it's like eating a tub of ice cream, right? It's fun. And there's not a ton of meaningful calories in it. But, sometimes art doesn't necessarily have to be that, right? Sometimes it can be just kind of a fun thrill ride. You don't go on a roller coaster to have a ton of meaning to it, right? Like that's the way I compare horror to sometimes, is it's like a roller coaster ride. It's like, you have the anticipation, like you're going up. And it's like, oh, this is probably not going to feel good. This is not going to be a good idea. And then once you're on it, that's it. You gotta see it right to the end.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to leave you with that today. If you want to see some more shorter episodes like this on a particular genre, or we pick apart just just something that's on our minds, or maybe something that's on your mind, send us an email, send us a message on Facebook, and we will talk to you next time.